I want to do is I want to talk about the difference between whiteness as a construct or structure versus white people. I need you to understand that those two things come apart. Whiteness is not a biological truth. Let's move on into the actual chapter content, whiteness and the Black imagination. So Hooks talks about whiteness in relation to the Black imagination because she sees it as a useful exercise in being able to help dismantle racism and racist structures. Generally, what she's observed is that there's a concern with whiteness and how the white mind perceives blackness, but there's not much of an analysis of the vice versa, right? Where the black mind has a perception of whiteness. So there's a limited view and critique on whiteness, and Hooks in part is going ahead and diving into that from her own personal experiences and some of the things that she's read and studied and taught. Part of what we do here is to talk about how invisibility is in and of itself a representation of white supremacy, and that caters to our issue and not having observed or critiqued whiteness enough. But when we get into that critique and that representation of whiteness in the Black imagination, Hooks identifies whiteness as a terrorizing representation in the Black imagination. Another thing we want to identify here is the fact that there's a distinction between the stereotypical representation of whiteness in the Black imagination versus the trauma response representation. She says, stereotypes are a fantasy, a projection onto the other that makes them less threatening. Stereotypes abound when there is distance. They are an invention, a pretense that one knows when the steps that would make real knowing possible cannot be taken or are not allowed. So stereotypes are rooted in this kind of false knowing. Like, it's not really a source of knowledge. It's a fiction that is created in the place of not having access. But there's a real knowing that Hooks is trying to get to. And that real knowing is tied into some of these experiences of terror in relation to whiteness. And so that's what she wants to dig into. I want to focus on that representation of whiteness that is not formed in reaction to stereotypes, but emerges as a response to the traumatic pain and anguish that remains a consequence of white racist domination. A psychic state that informs and shapes the way that Black folks see whiteness. So what she's talking about there, right, is that she wants to better understand the vision of whiteness that makes it threatening in and of itself, the one that's terrorizing, the one that's harmful. We get to this point in talking about whiteness as terror in the Black imagination. So Hooks gives various scenarios in which she talks about having to deal with white terror. She talks about them in relation to other people's experience and even her own growing up. She says, returning to memories of growing up in the social circumstances created by racial apartheid to all Black spaces on the edges of town, I re-inhabit a location where Black folks associated whiteness with the terrible, the terrifying, the terrorizing. White people were regarded as terrorists, especially those who dared to enter that segregated space of Blackness. Now you might be questioning, why is that? Why would white people be associated with terror? Well, what she's referencing is, first of all, her living in the South, and living in the South during times of like Jim Crow. She's referencing racial apartheid. And in that time period, Black people were literally locked up, murdered, hunted down, violated sexually, physically, emotionally, being seen as tools still out of an extension of the time of slavery. But now, even in their times of freedom, still being terrorized and being told that they're less than, not worthy, not even fully human. So that sense of terror and fear is associated with real world circumstances in which white people were being harmful to Black people. Where's this important relation to that structure? Well, that structure of white supremacy said, oh, it's okay for y'all to do that. The society of Jim Crow and racial apartheid, that was totally acceptable. It was within the right of those white people to do something like that. That was just seen as an extension of the power of being a white citizen. Not every white person took advantage of that. Not every white person was violent. Not every white person was harmful. Not every white person was racist. And took that power into their hands, but they had the potential to do so by means of being white people. And by means of being able to do that, and that pass of violence being given from being a white person and existing in white supremacist society, then those people then can become signifiers of a system of white supremacy and then be signifiers of terror, because there's literal terror and harm and violence going on a day-to-day basis against Black people existing in the system. So Hooks talks about her own experiences growing up and having to be mindful of what that whiteness means and what it represents. She says in order to uncover the system of whiteness as terror in the Black imagination, you have to go into a history that's often been dismissed, because in Hooks' context, society is living in a space in which we're talking about, racism is gone, we're past racism. So it's hard to articulate terror that comes from white supremacy in a society that says we're beyond white supremacy. Hooks says, in contemporary society, white and Black people alike believe that racism no longer exists. This erasure, however mythic, diffuses the representation of whiteness as terror in the Black imagination. It allows for assimilation and forgetfulness. The eagerness with which contemporary society does away with racism, replacing this recognition with evocations of pluralism and diversity that further mask reality, is a response to the terror. It has also become a way to perpetuate the terror by providing a cover, a hiding place. Black people still feel the terror, still associated with whiteness, but are rarely able to articulate the varied ways we are terrorized, because it is easy to silence by accusations of reverse racism or by suggesting that Black folks who talk about the ways we are terrorized by whites are merely evoking victimization to demand special treatment. At this point in time, she's living in a society in which this practice, which she thinks could be useful, but it's hard to do. It's hard to identify our history of terror in relation to whiteness in terms of that structure again. It's hard to identify that history and that reality and to criticize it when society is at a point in which it is trying to say that we no longer have racism. Racism no longer exists. So when society is saying that and trying to understand, we're all just people. Well, if you try and then go to talk about the differences between those people, the differences of treatment, the differences of social standing, the difference in protection and power, then there are accusations to come up about, now you're trying to be racist. And this is part of why at the beginning of this video, I try to make sure it's clear the distinction between whiteness as a structure versus white people. Because what's being talked about is not particularly those white people. We can talk about those white people who are literally doing the harm of the terror. But the bigger picture of what we're trying to identify there is the structure of white supremacy that allows for particular white individuals to take it upon themselves to enact harm and violence and not have the same kind of punishment as Black people would, or to not have punishment at all in some circumstances. What is the structure that is allowing that to happen? Allowing there to be white terror without punishment or with limited punishment, inequitable punishment in relation to Black peers. Or not peers, because in some kinds of contexts, not necessarily with Hooks here, but in some contexts, Black people can't even be seen as subjects, as human, because they're supposed to be in a position of objectivity. This is something we can talk about more in Afropessimism talk, but anyway, getting back to Hooks. It can be hard to identify white terror in a society that denies racism existing in the first place. All this is to say that there's an evaluation, there's a critique of whiteness that can come about by theorizing whiteness from the perspective of the Black imagination. And that critique can be helpful to help break down a lot of these assumptions that come into place and have us functioning in a place in which we don't question our system of power. So, to be able to stand in a position in which you're saying, we're all just human, to not have to face whiteness, to not have to see whiteness is a representation of a position of privilege. Specifically, Hooks says that itself is representation of the racism at play, because it shows that white people don't have to be visible. They can be visible, but they don't have to be visible, and they don't have to see others. So The problem is these things don't allow us to actually dismantle the system of racism, but it helps it to continue to exist and thrive. So for Hooks, it's important to not just accept the system as is, to not sit and accept this idea that we're beyond racism when reality serves to show a reality that is very different, at least for some folks, but to challenge that assumed reality by observing that reality from a different context, of a different position in the world. And that position that she's identifying is important to identify society through, to observe and critique society through, is the Black position. I think that she does that in part because she is a Black person and has that direct experience. But I also think that when you look at a system of white versus Black and the system of white supremacy, where white is good, Black is bad, that looking from the position of what's considered bad in relation to that good can be very insightful and can serve as one of the biggest challenges to that assumed system. Hooks essentially is giving us a challenge here. Let's start theorizing from the perspective of the Black imagination and how it perceives whiteness. And one of the things that you'll reveal is that the Black imagination perceives whiteness as terrorizing. And when you can see that, you can understand that, and you can understand how that comes to be, that is going to help decolonize the mind, and not to keep just assuming that whiteness is good and we're beyond racism and just assuming that things need to be as they are, but to be able to imagine new worlds, new realities in which we can say things don't have to be this way. And things are actually indeed harmful and violent and terrorizing. They're not all good. When you look from this position, we can imagine new realities. We can start to imagine realities if we can understand that the current reality is not our ideal. So with all that being said, one of the questions that I have many, but I'm just gonna stick with the main question that I have pondering in my mind at the end of this chapter is, are we there yet? Right? Because when Hooks is talking about this chapter, presumably, we're somewhere probably in the 90s. There's a lot of things that have happened since then. I think that in society today, we are not quite in the place anymore. I think there's still some remnants of that. But I don't think we're in the place anymore where a majority of us believe that we're beyond racism. I think that there's been quite a bit of conversation about how there's plenty of racism in today's society. The Supreme Court just ruled that it's okay to discriminate on race and ethnicity with regard to ICE and some of their pickups, which is really interesting in relation to the fact that, we couldn't consider race and ethnicity with regard to school admissions, but we can do that with regard to picking up people, snatching them off the street, separating them from families with crime. Anyway, there's been a lot of talk about racism and how it does exist and how society shows racism today. So I don't think that we're in a society that majority of us are like, oh, racism's dead, we're beyond that. Because I think ever since Obama was president, there's just been a lot of conversation about differences in treatment, differences in access, and just a lot of awakenings to how racism still shows its ugly head. It still is here. It was just hiding beneath the shadows. So with that being said, and us being in a position of having a society where I think a lot of us can at least identify a couple of different places in which racism exists in society today, it just begs the question of, okay, are we in a position to do what Hooks talks about on page 50? Are we in a position to critically examine the association of whiteness as terror in the Black imagination? Are we in a position to name racism impact and break its hold? Are we in a position to decolonize our minds and our imaginations? Have we already been doing that? And I feel like, to some extent, I feel like we've been in the middle of a lot of decolonization from some of our more open conversations in online spaces about racism, about whiteness and how it still exists as a structure and how it's harmful. We're having conversations right now through some of the really violent things that are going on in our country about racism and how that's showing up in the difference in acknowledgement about harms and deaths. We've been doing that since the Black Lives Matter movement, and we've been doing that in relation to race and gender with the Me Too movement. We are in the middle of some other movement that I don't know what we're going to be calling it, but we're in the middle of something else right now with regard to what's happening on a political spectrum. To what extent are we there, if we are? if Hooks would say, yeah, we're somewhere where we're in the middle of this, to watch somebody there and then like, how far do we take that? When do we know we're at a good enough point? Is it when we come up with new reality visions? How do we know we have a good one? What do we do? So I actually have a lot of questions left at the end of that about, okay, you want us to theorize about whiteness from the Black imagination and to understand whiteness not as just a peaceful, good space, but to understand whiteness as terror from that perspective. Understand the association of whiteness as terror in the Black imagination, deconstructing that. Where are we going with it? Where are we taking it? What do we do with it? How do we know we're doing it? How do we know we're doing it right? I guess the question of how do we know we're doing it right will come from, is it rooted in reality? Is it rooted in truth? Is it rooted in experience? Because that's part of how we came to that point. But yeah, I'm just left with those questions. What questions are y'all left with? What did you think about this chapter? There's a lot that happened here. And there's so many notes that I had that I couldn't even get to because I wanted to keep this short. But anyway, yeah, what all questions did you have? What are you left with? What are your thoughts lingering here? What are some things you struggle with? Maybe we can talk about those in the comments as well. If there's any question you're like, oh, I didn't really get this part, like, we can talk about that in the comments below as well. But yeah, I guess I'm done talking about stuff about this chapter. It feels really good to be back and engaging with y'all here, especially given what we're going through in the world right now. Yeah, hope y'all are finding some solace and thinking like I am. And hopefully the next video, I'm not congested and over here sniffling and having to dab my nose every few minutes. But okay, see y'all in the next video.